Operation Desert Storm in the Persian Gulf, 1991. Coalition forces led by the United States rolled back Iraq's unprovoked invasion of Kuwait. Success came from unprecedented international cooperation. But visible on some thin flashes was evidence of local contribution to that international effort. The state units of the American Air National Guard. The citizen airmen of the Air National Guard traced their heritage to the colonial militias. Today, they form an integral part of U.S. defense posture. But it took several decades, several international crises, and some serious politics to win their right to fight as units. 75 years before the Persian Gulf War, there had been another international crisis. Mexican revolutionary Pancho Villa's raid on Columbus, New Mexico. Among those mobilized in 1916 was the Guard's 1st Aero Company of New York. By November, the unit was released from active duty. The disappointed New Yorkers never served on the Mexican border with the National Guard. Captain Reynold Bowling, a prominent New York attorney, commanded his 1st Guard aviation unit. He came to the conclusion that National Guard air units would never be practicable. When the U.S. entered World War I the following year, the Army followed Bowling's advice and disbanded Guard aviation units. Guard aviators went on to distinguish themselves not as units, but as individuals. Major Reed Chambers of the Tennessee Guard became an ace and flew with his friend and fellow ace, Eddie Rickenbacker. 2nd Lieutenant Irwin Bleckley of the Kansas Guard became the 1st National Guard aviator to be awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. After the war, the Army General Staff continued to believe, despite the distinction of individual flyers, that Guard air units were not practical. To convince them otherwise, National Guard interests took on Washington. They parlayed post-war enthusiasm for flying into support for National Guard aviation. In 1921, the 109th Observation Squadron of the Minnesota National Guard became the first of 29 post-war air units to receive federal recognition. Charles Lindbergh of the Missouri Guard became the most famous Guard pilot of the interwar period. He represented the new generation of Guard airmen in the 20s. Lindbergh's solo flight across the Atlantic in 1927 would make aviation history. Army airmen concluded in the early 30s that the Guard's air observation mission was obsolescent. By the end of the decade, their attention was focused on Europe and the new threat of total war. By Pearl Harbor, all 29 Guard observation squadrons were mobilized and absorbed into the Army Air Forces.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
When the U.S. entered the war, some Guard units maintained their integrity. But as in World War I, they served chiefly to supply individuals to organize and train the expanding active duty force. In the meantime, Guard air units and individuals served in every combat theater during the war. As Guard leaders saw their air units broken up, they developed new determination to keep them together when hostilities ended. The post-war fate of Guard aviation was not decided in combat, but by the persuasive skills of National Guard leaders like Milton Record and Ellard Walsh. These generals persuaded Congress and Army Generals Hap Arnold and George Marshall that it was politically impossible to freeze the Guard out of the nation's post-war defense plans. A reluctant Army Air Forces agreed to include the Air Guard in those plans. Primarily a fighter force, the Air Guard officially became a separate reserve component of the brand new U.S. Air Force on September 18, 1947. But in the Cold War era, what looked good on paper did not work out as well in the field. Guard aircraft became increasingly obsolescent in the age of jets. One Air Force general referred to the Air Guard as flyable storage. Even some guardsmen called the air units state-sponsored flying clubs. Relations deteriorated further when Secretary of Defense James Forrestal tried to strip the Air Guard of its state ties. Congress blocked the attempt. When North Korean troops suddenly attacked South Korea in June 1950, there was a new international crisis. All the post-war weakness of the Air National Guard became evident in the Korean mobilization. Guardsmen needed 7 months to become combat ready. Once ready, they served with distinction. But by now, the lessons of 2 world wars and their aftermaths were clear. Unless the Air Guard became structurally integrated with the active duty Air Force, it would not survive. No one understood this concept or helped execute it better than Major General Winston Wilson, an Arkansas Air Guardsman who had been one of those mobilized in 1950. He came to Washington, D.C. for an expected tour of 21 months. He stayed 21 years. General Wilson fought hard to acquire modern aircraft and facilities. But his real contribution was to insist on tougher training standards and definite wartime missions for the Guard. The Guard began to change from a flying club into a valued reserve component of the Air Force. This publicity film from the 1950s depicts the Runway Alert program, typical of the significant policy innovations of this period. General Wilson himself tells the audience the importance of real-world operations such as Runway Alert.
What this means is that Air National Guard organizations all over the country are constantly training, ever on guard, and ready at a moment's notice to take to the air in the defense of your home, your community, our nation.
By the mid-50s and early 60s, some Air Guard units began to convert to airlifters. Runways were too short for increasingly high-performance fighters. Airlift capability increased the value of the Guard within the Air Force. Not coincidentally, it preserved the existence of some units. Berlin, 1961. When the Soviet Union attempted to drive out the Western Allies, President Kennedy called up the reserves. It was the first test of the Air Guard's readiness after the post-Korea innovations. 11 fighter squadrons deployed to Europe. Combat readiness had required 7 months in Korea. In Berlin, they were ready in a month. In the 1960s, Air Guardsmen continued to support state and local authorities. They trained to deal with the unrest spawned by the Civil Rights Revolution and the growing opposition to the draft and the Vietnam War. By 1968, both the war at home and the war in Vietnam were not going well. That year, President Lyndon Johnson called up a few reserves. Faced with the Pueblo crisis in Korea and with the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, he ordered fighter and reconnaissance units of the Guard to Asia. Concentrating on bombing enemy lines of communication and troops in the field, Air Guard fighter units in Vietnam performed extremely well. In 1970, the Nixon administration originated the total force concept. In essence, a continuation of innovative programs such as Runway Alert from the 1950s. The Guard would now be fully integrated into both training and real-world operations of the Air Force. A precursor to total force had been Operation Creek Party, a real-world operation that lasted 10 years. Air Guardsmen flying KC-97Ls maintained a continuous tanker rotation from 1967 to 1977 in Germany. It was the first major sustained overseas operation with volunteers supporting the regular operations of the Air Force. Sergeant Jerry Forbes noted that the regulars didn't seem to mind pulling up to a boom pod manned by volunteers.
I refueled every fighter in the Air Force inventory with it, and I don't think we've had any complaints.
But for total force to be effective as the nation ended the draft in 1973, the volunteer forces had to have demanding peacetime missions. In Greenland, the Air Guard assumed primary responsibility for specialized missions like resupplying isolated radar stations. Starting in 1977, Operation Volant Oak provided theater airlift support to the U.S. Southern Command in Panama. The return of the Air Guard to its historic reliance on true volunteers for peacetime service in the 1970s also ushered in changes in the social composition of the Guard.
05, runway 07.
Women had, since 1956, served first as nurses, then only in support units. After the Vietnam War, women began to enter non-traditional fields. In January 1978, Second Lieutenant Marilyn Kuhn of Arizona became the Air Guard's first female pilot. Minorities had always been poorly represented. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 gave federal officials the power to integrate the Guard, but real progress did not begin until the 1970s. The Air Guard was ready when the United States invaded Grenada in 1983 and then Panama in 1989. But the real test for the Air Guard's progress under total force came in the Persian Gulf in 1990 and 1991. Over 12,000 Air Guardsmen served during the crisis. Air Guard units were rapidly integrated into Air Force operations. It was one of the most successful military campaigns in U.S. history. Now, in the post-Cold War era, the mission of the Air Guard is changing again. The main challenges are famine in Somalia, political turmoil in Haiti, the drug war in South America, and disaster relief.
We're doing all kinds of different activities besides airlift. I mean, we're feeding, we're carrying, we're guarding. You know, we're fulfilling probably just about any activity you can think of that's necessary.
Air Guard tankers and airlifters play an increasingly important role as active duty forces are reduced in the 90s. The Guard is now responsible for the air defense of the continental United States. The B-1B became the Air Guard's first heavy bomber. In over 80 years of flying operations, the Guard has had to fight not only enemies abroad, but difficult problems at home as well. The talent of individual members was recognized from the beginning. But the modern Air Guard's right to fight as units had to be established progressively and not without setbacks over the decades. Advanced weapons are a reminder that the Air National Guard is no longer a flying club, no longer a manpower pool for the active forces. It has a historically defined and vital place in America's national defense.